Hello, good to see you all with us today. My name is Aisha Tamajang, and this session, the webinar that we have today, is part of Humentum's Innovating Towards a Viable Future webinar series. So this series has been designed to move us from sense making towards intentional navigation of what comes next. We've all seen what's happening in our social goods sector for the past year. Things have been, they've changed significantly. We're not just been under pressure, but there's been a huge disruption. So we're talking about the freeze and the restructuring of the US foreign assistance, the executive orders, and just the broader funding contractions that have really shifted the way in which organizations operate. We've seen programs being paused, contracts have been terminated, and then risk tolerance narrowed. We want to use the conversation that we have today, not just to talk about some of the policy aspects of what has happened, but really examining the responsibilities that we have during transitions. So how funding decisions shape the futures that we're trying to rebuild, intentionally or not. So we urge you all to use the chats to introduce yourselves or to share your vantage points. And you can also ask our panelists and the moderator questions there. And this is really a space that we wanted to create for us all to convene and have this important conversation about, funder responsibilities and the futures that we're creating. And it's a space for clarity, not for blame. We are all here to just have a very insightful conversation, and we have some very phenomenal panelists joining us, and a great moderator, my colleague Sheila, who I will pass the mic on to. I will also quickly say that the session is being recorded, and thank you all for joining.
Thanks, Aisha. So hello, everyone, and thanks for making time to join us on this webinar. And we'd like to just welcome you all. My name is Sheila Nemi, and I work as a technical director at Humentum. And in my role, I direct large programs that we are running that are focused on institutional strengthening at scale and really aimed at enhancing organization resilience. And I also provide technical support on Humentum's initiatives related to governance, risk, compliance, and responsible AI governance. And I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. On this webinar, we are really going back to what we've witnessed in the last 1 year or slightly above 1 year by now. And since we know, there's been a very big significant shift in funding that has really disrupted organizations to the extent of raising questions about long-term sustainability, but also has raised very significant concerns about the resilience of the social goods sector. And what we've learned in this series that we've been running as Humentum is that different actors have experienced these transitions in very many, very different ways, where there are some who felt the impact more profoundly than others. And now, based on that, today we invited 3 very esteemed panelists to share their insights on this topic from their unique perspectives. And in the next 1 hour, they'll discuss with us how the funding shifts and foreign assistance disruptions have landed and the responsibilities that funders carry in these evolving times. So please join me in welcoming Lisa, Megan, and Rachel to this webinar. And I'd like to just invite them to introduce themselves before we start the discussion. Lisa?
Thank you so much, Sheila. Thanks to the Humentum team for bringing all of us together. It's wonderful to be here. My name is Lisa Corcoran, and I serve as the Chief of Staff at Bloodwater. Our Executive Director and our Africa Partnerships Director, who are both based in Kenya, are currently on a flight right now to meet one of our partners, so I'm stepping in today from the United States to represent the Bloodwater team. That's me, but quickly, if I can just introduce everyone to Bloodwater. We are a collaborative funder and technical partner that invests in African-led organizations addressing the HIV and water-related health disparities across East and Southern Africa. For more than 20 years, our focus has been on strengthening the frontline organizations that communities already trust. So we partner with locally led organizations for a period of 8 years, providing flexible funding alongside organizational strengthening. That organizational strengthening can look like whatever the partner wants it to look like for every $1 US that we invest with flexible funding, we invest $1 in that organization's strengthening. We've partnered with 38 organizations over since our inception, and we've worked in 13 different countries. And throughout this time, we have served 12 million people with community-led health solutions. So I come to you all today as a partner to locally led organizations across East and Southern Africa. I also want to share that at the same time, we ourselves are raising money to make these partnerships possible. So we sit in a really unique position in the ecosystem where we're seeking philanthropic resources ourselves, but also walking closely with partner organizations who are implementing some work on the ground. So thank you all so much, and I'm excited for the conversation today.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I would like to welcome Megan.
Hi, everyone. Great to see you all. And thank you to Humentum for organizing this. I am Megan Waters. I am currently the CEO of Yamale Alliance. It is a new organization that is established here in Dakar. I live in Dakar, Senegal. Yamale means equal footing in Wolof. And the purpose of our organization is to improve the legal infrastructure across Africa to support businesses and governments in their growth and development. We are a two-entity structure that has a for-profit and a nonprofit, so sort of a unique structuring. Our for-profit is putting together a platform that we hope will sort of shift the legal knowledge and accessibility across the continent. And then our nonprofit focuses on representing governments, communities in their negotiations with foreign actors and intra-Africa. And I previously was a contracting officer at USAID. And so I'm coming at this from sort of a funder perspective from that role, and now in a new role as a recipient and funder at the same time, and so sort of a unique position. And I'm really happy to be here. So thank you, and nice to meet you all.
Thanks so much, Megan. And Rachel?
Great. Thank you, Sheila. And thank you, Humentum, for organizing this panel. I'm really excited to be with such amazing women. So Rachel Hughey, I'm the Senior Partnerships Officer at the Hilton Foundation. I sit in the executive office and I support what we think of as our cross-cutting grant-making strategies. The Hilton Foundation is the family foundation, not the corporate from the Hilton hotels. And we focus on 7 areas, both domestically and globally, to improve the human condition. And our entrance point to this conversation is really on our support for locally led development. So starting in 2024, the Hilton Foundation made a whole organization commitment to move at least 25% of our resources directly to local actors. I think at this point we've exceeded that and are closer to 30 or to 40% on an annual basis. And yeah, just excited to be part of the conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, all of you, for joining. And we can just now go into the discussion. And I'd like to extend the first question to Rachel. Maybe given what's happened in the last year or so, what changed inside the foundation when all this funding volatility increased? Are there any trade-offs you had to make? And if there are, what did that look like? Just to share our experience. How did this look like for the foundation?
Yeah, thank you so much. I can remember the early days of funding crisis and the dissolution of USAID really vividly. It's one of those events that feels stark in my mind, like there's a beginning and an end. But the truth is that we all know official development assistance has been on decline for a long time. So this is something we've actually been talking about as an organization for a while. I'd say I've Are you able to mute folks who are?
Yeah, I think there's the let me just a second.
I've been that person in a staff meeting one time. It happens. What was I saying? From the perspective of philanthropy, I think one of the very first realizations we had was that certainly the Hilton Foundation and really the philanthropic sector as a whole can't fill the gap that the spending crisis by official development assistance is leaving, right? We're just such a small percentage. And so like working under that assumption, what are the things that we can do and what is philanthropy uniquely positioned to fill? What gaps are we uniquely positioned to fill? And so for the Hilton Foundation, that was really three things that we took on. One is whenever possible, we have been working to stabilize our existing partners who had significant cuts to their own budgets due to USAID. We had some organizations with up to like 80% exposure of funding lost, which is really, pretty painful to think about. Um, so we offered flexible funding to a lot of those organizations and leaned a lot on lessons that we learned during the COVID pandemic. I still think there's a lot of parallels there. And then the second is we looked at what are kind of the unique areas we can play in the medium term to ensure the survival of organizations beyond just funding. So I think one great example of this is investing in civic strength partners, which helps organizations think through different kind of partnerships and like long-term collaborations. And then the third thing that we're looking at is what is the future of global development and how can philanthropy help ensure that what comes next is more fit for purpose than what we were experiencing to date, right? I think as much as it's been doing incredible good in the world, there's also been a lot of flaws baked in. And so we've actually launched the Funders Roundtable on the future of global development to really try and put global majority voices at the center of those conversations and, build back something more fit for purpose. Like I spoke for a really long time. So thanks, Sheila.
Okay, thanks, Rachel, for that insight. And I'll also just want to hear from Megan that having worked inside USAID and now you're outside, are there any structural shifts that have become very visible to you? Like, what have you noticed that has changed?
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. So I will say, I mean, obviously last year was a traumatic year, to say the least. Excuse me. Lost my job, lost our career, lost all of the work we were doing, and it felt really heavy for several months. But I have to say, is coming into 2026, I actually have more hope for international development than I think I ever had at USAID. And I say that because I think that the conversation is shifting in that those in the funding space and those on the ground doing the work um, are listening more than acting. And what that means is I think there's a lot of shift towards understanding what is actually needed because obviously budgets are more tight than they used to be. And I think it gives an opportunity for, people often push back on me when I say this, but I think it gives governments an opportunity to regain a bit of sovereignty. Obviously, USAID was huge. We were, beholden to the US Congress and the president and whoever wanted to make decisions in government. And I think there's a sort of almost like a freedom now of that countries can actually choose what they want to do instead of being told what to do. And I think giving a new space and I think as funders it's important to make sure that we're listening in that space and that we're really hearing what countries need, not what we want them to want. And so I think that's been an exciting shift. And then from my new position as sort of starting something new, I think it gives an opportunity for entities too that are receiving the funding to shift how we're doing business. And I think it's really important that we also think of our long-term sustainability and structures that will work because I think that was a weakness of USAID was that we gave a lot of money, but we didn't necessarily make sure that the entities receiving it were sustainable. So I can talk more about that, but that's sort of my view right now and most hopeful I've been in a really long time.
Okay, thanks, Megan, for that very positive outlook. And Lisa, there's something you mentioned on institutional strengthening, and I just want us to look at how that, if we look at it from the current discussion on funders' responsibilities and how it can be used to respond to some of these changes we are having, and maybe just your experience in Bloodwater on that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this is, to like kind of tag on to Megan and Rachel's points about this being a moment a traumatic moment for so many organizations, so many leaders, so many community members. But this is a moment for us to do things better than we have been as an ecosystem. This is a moment for us to like take a good, hard, long look in the mirror. It was what we were doing working. I think probably everyone in this room can say no. Some parts of it were, but on the whole, it was not. So what can we do now to do better? To do better across the social sector. So what can funders do? I think, this is probably not going to come as a surprise to anyone in this room, but I have, really just like three thoughts on what we can do in the funding space to do better. And one, like Megan and Rachel just said, I think it comes down to communication and listening. In moments of disruption, I think that organizations need early, honest dialogue so that our community leaders can plan responsibly rather than react in response to sudden shocks. Local leaders know exactly where those pressure points are and exactly what they need, whether that's staffing or technology or administrative burdens. And so responsible funders can stay in the dialogue rather than making decisions at a distance. And I think the term trust-based philanthropy is very buzzy, and it has been for the last, 5 years or maybe longer. And we all talk about trust-based philanthropy, but I think this is the time where we're all called upon to really walk the walk when it comes to trust-based philanthropy. And not just say we're doing it, but sit partner to partner and talk about what does trust-based philanthropy mean for you? Because it could mean something different country to country, region to region, organization to organization. So how can we create this relationship that's really grounded in trust, transparency, and open dialogue so that when there's funding disruptions like what we're seeing right now, we can lessen the negative impact that's going to happen downstream, first to the organization and second to the people that they're serving. So I think it starts with talking and listening. Gosh, Megan, you just said something I wrote. I literally put quotes on it. Not what we want them to want. So how do we get to the point where we can avoid that? It's through really great conversation. I think secondly, and this won't surprise anyone, as I talked about Bloodwater's model being so grounded in strengthening organizations, I think responsible funders do really need to consider the health of the organization, not just the project, and not just finishing the project and having the outcomes that that the funder wanted going into the project. When funding changes suddenly, organizations have enormous amounts of pressure put on them around staff, systems, communities depending on them. I think what we've seen over the last year is that we're asking organizations to do more with less, and it's not going to work in the long run. So I think if funders can equalize projects with organizational health, and when I say equalize, what I mean is consider them just as important, organizational health just as important as the project. I think this is a way that the social sector by at large is going to be able to absorb changes like this more. And third, flexibility becomes even more important. When leaders have flexibility in how resources are used, they can make the decisions they need to protect their teams. Rachel, I was thrilled to hear you say that one of the things you all learned during COVID and that you're doing going forward is providing more flexible funding. I think we need to trust organizations to know where those funds are needed at that moment in time.
Okay, thanks so much, Lisa, for your three inputs, and I'll follow up later, but I also just wanted to follow up something that Rachel said on the Funders Roundtable. Rachel, you discussed that there's the Funders Roundtable on global development that has. I just wanted if you could give us more information. Has this started? What's happening? What conversations are coming from that particular roundtable that you feel? Just a bit more details on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to share. And just a big plus one to everything that Lisa said about how funders should be operating right now. So the Funders Roundtable for the Future of Global Development officially launched in September of last year at the UN General Assembly in New York. And it launched after a period where I think philanthropy, we were doing our best to listen to communities and to the organizations that we partner with. And I think really think through what the best next steps for the sector are. So it's a space where senior leadership, CEOs and senior directors some of the largest foundations in the United States can come together and across the world. We're doing our best also to diversify from different regions. So we have some organizations from Europe and Africa joining, but we always need help with that actually. So it's a space for these senior leaders to come together and be more coordinated in our approach to this very kind of disruptive and chaotic period in the global ecosystem. And so we've come together around 4 main shifts that we'd like to see in the sector going forward. As we've all agreed, the global development ecosystem hasn't been working super great forever. And so these are carefully worded, and I can drop the link in the chat later so people can look at them directly. But kind of shorthand, the first shift is around both preserving and reforming official development assistance. So in my mind, I think of this as just trying to keep money in the system and dollars flowing to projects in general, but also improving how those dollars work. The second is around innovative financing, because we know that there's a need for blended capital and different fiscal policies and just whole new ways of looking at getting resources to into countries. The third is, I think, where most of the funders are going to be spending most of their time, and that's around centering global majority leadership in these conversations and really directly resourcing some of the efforts that are coming from different regions of the world. So there's some meetings in Buenos Aires coming up. We have a big event in Nairobi, really thinking through how to reshape the system. And then the last is just improving coordination among philanthropy. I think, funders tend to be asking partners to work together quite frequently. And I think that there's a lot we could do on our end to improve how we work together. So those are the goals, and it's mostly conversations today and then trying to facilitate like the identification of projects to work on and things like that.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. And I also had a follow-up question for Megan. You spoke about sustainability, and you say there's more you can say on that. And maybe just to give you an opportunity, if you could just expand on that point, your last point on sustainability.
Yeah.
Megan?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it goes to a little bit to point two that Rachel just spoke to the innovative financing. And I bring this up because I think one of the takeaways from the entire system being shooken up is how many organizations were unable to survive after their funding from USAID went away. And I think Rachel spoke earlier about how, many of the entities that they work with receive some up to 80-90% were from USAID. In Uganda, where I was most recently, we had, probably over 70%, 70-80% of our partners were 100% USAID funded. And that's not a sustainable model. And that anyone who worked with me as a partner in the technical teams in the Uganda mission heard me say over and over, even in USAID, this is not a sustainable model. We can't keep, for example, funding all of the healthcare workers for an entire country, because when our funding goes away, then what happens to that entire system? And so I think one of the things I'm really intentionally doing, and again, I'm looking at everything sort of from a legal perspective right now, and even from like a basic, Yamale started as this idea to really focus on equal footing between governments and foreign investors. And then as we sort of dug deeper and deeper, you realize that the foundational legal aspects of entities, of businesses, of NGOs, of sort of any actor in the continent is not necessarily there. And so, for example, USAID may have been funding people who were on paper registered, but are they internalizing the regulations? If things shift, are they able to make those shifts with that? Are there sort of protocols in place internally on what their fundraising policy is, or their human resources policy? There's so many layers of it, right? And so we decided, and early on we also decided very intentionally to set up a dual entity model where we were creating a product that will go to market and be sold and utilize those funds ourselves to self-fund the nonprofit side of us. And I'm not saying every entity can do that. I just truly believe to my core that this idea that you can just sustain yourself on constantly getting money from another entity is just not one that is long-term viable. And so I do think that And it would be great, I think, if philanthropists, particularly who tend to have, phenomenal knowledge in the business space and the financing space, could be working with some of these entities to understand what, innovative financing means and how to diversify where you're getting your funds from and sort of all the different caveats that go into that. I think it's super, super important, especially right now.
Okay,
Sheila, would it
thanks
be
so much.
okay if I jump in to
Yeah,
tag
please
on?
go ahead.
Okay,
Please.
thanks. I think Megan talking about how this impacted some of their partners in Uganda. I thought this was a good time to share what we're seeing in the field with our blood water partners. Um, as soon as the funding started to freeze and some of the stop work orders were put into place, we did a deep dive and issued a survey amongst our partners to see how they were being impacted. And what we found is that on average, 31% of our partner budgets were impacted. Losses ranged from 218,000 US dollars to over 2 million for organizations. And what we found was that this impacted programs reaching 38,000 community members across half of our partner organizations. So this included clinical HIV care, biomedical prevention, as well as kind of the wraparound support services in the health space. So I want to share this gives you kind of a real feeling of how abrupt these funding cuts were. Our partners had to terminate 67 staff members almost immediately. On top of this, there's the psychological impact of being afraid of funding shrinking and of funders doubling down on current grantees, which is absolutely understandable. But there's a fear that how can I find new funding at this moment in time? That's the tough part. That's the hard pill to swallow. But I would be so remiss if I didn't share the other side of that coin. And that's something remarkable that we've seen amongst our partners since this disruption has occurred. While many larger programs were forced to shut down, what we found is that African-led, community-rooted organizations have stepped up to keep services going and find ways to support their community. Our research showed that of those 67 staff members that were laid off, more than half have continued on in a volunteer capacity because they didn't want families and children living with HIV to lose access to care and to lose support. Now, this is not sustainable for the long term, but I just share it as a way to show how these locally led organizations and community health workers are the ones who are going to show up day after day, long after all of the other partners leave. It's a powerful reminder that these organizations who are deeply rooted to their community are going to keep going and keep doing the work. So I hope in this year of trauma, Megan, trauma going towards hope, going towards, perhaps other evolutions of the global funding landscape. I hope that we can see it's really important that we continue to uplift, elevate, and sustain local leadership as those people who are best positioned to address, the situation on the ground.
Okay, thanks, Lisa, for that. And I know there's something also Megan mentioned on that, which when she was talking about the sector changes, where she was saying that it also just opened up an opportunity for even leadership, not just at the local level, but also at government level to just step in and, take responsibility, which is one of the it just something has to fill in that vacuum. And that was one of the positive things that she said had to actually be done. I think we might have another discussion how it's actually happening and whether it's happening, but it just created that opportunity, which you've now also said, not just at that government level, but also at the local level, it actually did happen. Maybe before I continue, I wanted to ask Aisha whether there are any questions for the panelists, or we can still continue with the discussion. Aisha, I can't see the chats properly.
No, we can continue.
Okay. I think now as we move on, there's another aspect of the discussion in terms of now, since we've kind of looked at what happened in the future, what's happening right now, what happened in the past, what's happening right now, and now would like to see if do a sense making for the future. And a critical question, which is I'm going to ask the panelists to just answer based on also their experiences. If the current funding, what I would call maybe characteristics or behavior continue for the next few years? In your own thinking, what kind of sector do you think or do you envision we are creating? I don't know which would like to start.
So I can start a little bit. I'm not sure if I can name a specific kind of sector we're creating. I will say I do think there is some reality that we created an industry of an international development that is not also best suited to lead to to long-term development. And so I do think we need to do a real shift on that. But one of the things that I think, and I can speak more towards Africa on this point, but I think one of the things you're starting to see is you're starting to see intra-Africa communication and strategizing and planning that you didn't necessarily see before. And you're starting to see governments particularly push back. I mean, I know there, at least Zambia and Zimbabwe, and one other said no to the U.S. government's health agreements. I think you're starting to see African governments regain their voice a bit. And with that comes sort of a shift across the continent as to where things I think are headed. And I mean, obviously I can't see into the future, but I can feel it, that there's this kind of momentum starting to build. And I think African countries are turning more internally to say, how do we work with one another? I will say over and over again, I think on this continent, the resources are there. The capital is even here more than people give it credit to be. It's just a matter of putting the pieces and the actors together and really sort of rising up together. And I think, I mean, the war in Iran is another great example of this. You can't, if you're always reliant on the outside, it's going to have an impact on you. And so with the resources that are already here, why not find ways to take that and utilize it for development internally versus always looking externally for the resources. And I think that's not necessarily an industry that's developing, or maybe it is. Under the Continental Free Trade Agreement, for example, maybe there is sort of more of an trade industry there developing. But I think it's more of like a mindset shift, and a mindset shift that, in my opinion, is long overdue.
Okay, so there's just the aspect of our government stepping up and kind of realizing they do have a role to play. And I think for all of us, if that would actually, even if not all of them, but you have those that step up and the examples and we talk about it, I think that would be a really big shift in the social good sector. So that's okay. I think that's a whole thread on its own.
Well, and
Um,
even I would say even for NGOs and for civil society, it's also demonstrating to government that things can work, or businesses. I mean, there are businesses, and again, back at USAID, I was presented with so many really incredible ideas, things that would have completely revolutionized industries and countries and economies. And I couldn't fund them because I have to fund what Congress was telling me to fund. I couldn't just fund them. And I think
mm,
one of the real opportunities here for funders, since we're in this discussion about funders, is finding those things, funding those things. And if it means funding a private company that is doing an awesome thing, I think what it takes is showing glimmers of hope, showing that a model can work, even if it's a small, like Rwanda's business registration system, demonstrating that that can work in Rwanda, then says to other governments, this could work for you too. And it's kind of, if you can just show little things that work here and there, I think you're gonna see the ball start rolling a little bit more.
okay. And maybe also, Rachel, from your perspective, in terms of just the same, if we look at what's happening, all the shifts that have happened, what kind of sector would you envision that would be emerging in a few years to come?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just want to say I think Megan's first point that global development is an industry, right? That had built up, there's like thinking about the incentives that have been involved in that industry for so long, I think is going to be a key part of the puzzle going forward. And I love her vision for like an African-led future. And that really feels like the only sustainable path to me. What I worry about and what I can just feel happening in these conversations is the gravitational pull back to the way things have always been and the way systems have always functioned. I think that that's like muscle memory for so many global development organizations, especially those that are based here in the US and doing work overseas, which is, not a small portion of it. So in my mind, it's really the responsibility of the funders to keep this healthy tension and pushing towards a more locally led future. I think that's possible. I agree that the resources are there and that the ingenuity is there. And Megan, as you were talking, I was like making notes on folks I want to connect you with. Like I can see it happening, but I think that it's something that we are going to have to actively work towards. I don't think it will just happen without that kind of pressure.
Okay. And maybe just to follow up, Rachel, because I've liked what you said that there might be a tendency to just fall back to, the comfort zone that everybody is used to. And maybe there has to be that very intentional shift or an intentional decision that things have to change. And I guess that's what I'm picking from your discussion.
Yeah, that's what I would say. I think, and if not now, when is kind of what I keep hearing in my head, right? We've been talking about local development for at least 25 years, maybe longer, but this disruption, and not discounting how painful it has been and that, many lives have been lost, but it is also like a very unique opportunity to remake the fundamentals of the system, I think, in a lot of ways. And so I hope that people have the boldness to kind of step into that.
Okay. Thanks, Rachel. Maybe Lisa, just a follow-up. There's something you spoke about on trust-based and flexible funding. And I could see also from the charts, people did acknowledge the whole flexible funding perspective. And when you spoke about the three things that we look at when we are looking at the funding situation, and I just wanted to ask, with that, the flexible funding, the trust-based, like, and the kind of sector that we are envisioning in the future, and maybe just to see how do we ensure that the funders or the sector just doesn't go back to what it's used to, and just this becomes a reality, like we are speaking flex. And I know for Bloodwater, you've really done a bit on this and done quite a lot on this. And maybe you can just speak to that also.
Thanks, Sheila. It's a really good question. I mean, it's kind of the question as far as I'm concerned. How do we ensure we don't go back? I think what we probably need to do as a sector is continue to uplift local leaders and show that it's working. I almost think this might be an unfortunate reality, but it's almost like we need to prove prove that this is working. And once we have that evidence there, and once we can start to change the global mindset around how much risk is involved with funding local leaders, once we can change that mindset, I think that's how we ensure we don't go back. And how do we de-risk that? We build strong organizations behind that local leader. And I mentioned this in our prep call for this panel today, but I think everyone in this room, all 50 some of us, can probably think of that really remarkable person they know who's a community leader, kind of one of one, carries an organization on their back through blood, sweat, and tears. Everyone in the community knows this person, goes to this person, and they've done such great work, but it's really based on one leader, right? That's risky. I mean, that person is a gift to this earth, and I appreciate everything he or she has done, but it's risky, and that so much of it is dependent on that one person. So how do we build really strong organizations underneath them? One, to help that person so they don't have to carry so much on their own shoulders, but two, to create a durable, lasting system in place behind that person. So we create strong institutions, which makes it less risky for funders to invest in these organizations. And in so doing, we're also showing that these locally led organizations are the ones that are leading to real change in their communities. And I'm coming from this from a health perspective, but I think you could carry this across all parts of the social sector. So we're showing that this is the best investment, this is the best investment for funders to make. If you want more bang for your buck, or whatever the currency is that we're going to think about, if you want more bang for that, you're going to have more impact by investing in these organizations. So we need to de-risk those investments, I believe. And then I think we need to continue to shout from the rooftops, this is working. This is working. Let's not go back to the old ways of, of pouring all of the funds into the same 10 INGOs. And by the way, I hope this does not come across in any way, shape, or form as any sort of slam or insult against any of those organizations who are doing amazing work. I'm not saying instead of, I'm saying in addition to. And so I hope, Sheila, that's the way we could maybe prevent that muscle memory taking over.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Because of time, I'd like to open it up to the audience. If you have any questions or any comments you'd like to provide to our panelists, you can either raise your hand or even ask in the chat.
We have a question here that says, so this question is to Lisa. So I'll just read the comment. We need to reward those local heroes that are taking the risk and creating these supportive communities. My question is, how can we create a disciplineship or inter-community monitorship system?
Yeah. Thanks, Aisha, and thanks for the question. I think I understand. How can we create a way to grow and raise local talent to continue the work the great work that's happening on the ground? And I think this is just part of the larger ecosystem of growing and supporting local leaders. At Bloodwater, we're in the process ourselves, Rachel, much like you're building a collaborative, we're building something that we call the Leader Collective, and we're inviting leaders across Africa to join. And we are holding both online courses you can take, synchronous and asynchronous, and there's a lot of professional development opportunities within that. So I think there needs to be more like that. And I think one advantage to flexible funding and organizational strengthening funding is it allows the local leaders to decide this is a priority to them, to grow other leaders in the community, and they could maybe offer paid internships or bring in more staff or host their own leadership roundtables in their community. So I think, for me, all roads kind of go back towards organizational strengthening and flexible funding, because if this is a gap that's identified in a community, there should be funding. Ideally, there will be funding there for these leaders to grow that themselves in the way that works for their communities.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Aisha, I'll just ask if you could also check for me the chats if there are any questions or comments for the panelists.
We don't have any more comments or questions right now. We have some remarks, but no questions.
Okay, and maybe
But perhaps if one of the other panelists wanted to respond to that question as well.
Yeah, I can jump in. My small human has joined me for the remainder of this presentation. Sorry, it's early in the West Coast of the
We have
US.
another question, actually.
Okay.
We have a question from Eve. My question is to Megan and Lisa. When we talk about sustainability and flexibility, do you plan to increase the fees or percentage of management fees or indirect cost?
So I'll just say I don't work for USAID anymore because USAID's not around anymore. And I will tell you with confidence that the State Department will not be doing that, unfortunately. I do think that was like the number one question I got often. And one of the things I was intentionally trying to do as a contracting officer was to build to not use every penny of every technical activity for technical purposes, but also to try to build into awards funding for these pieces that was in addition to, not part of indirect costs. But yeah, unfortunately, I can only speak to the U.S. government, and it's one of the only things I know about moving forward is that there will not be increase in those fees probably. I'm sure Lisa has sort of more creative ways on how to deal with that.
Thanks, Megan. And thanks for the question, Eve. You know, at Bloodwater specifically, this is not a problem for us because we devote 50% of our funding to an organization. We ask them, put this towards your organizational strengthening, put it towards those fees and indirect costs that other funders would say is too high. So if you want to spend, 10,000 US dollars on a fundraising consultant because you need to develop a funding strategy, by all means, go ahead and don't factor that into your administrative costs. It's a separate bucket of money from us. And we are very intentionally set up that way because we think for every bit of money that goes towards an organization's ability to deliver on programs, that same amount of money should go towards an organization's ability to strengthen itself. So it's not a problem from where we sit because we've very deliberately set up our funding model that way. Now, as far as other funders, we are trying as much as possible, and thank you to the Humentum team for inviting us again today. We're out there in the global funding space trying to share our model with others and share the ways that it has worked. I don't have the statistics off the very top of my head right now, but we collect a lot of data on the partners that we have. And over 8 years, they see something like a 35% increase in their ability to deliver programs. I'll put these stats actually in the chat as soon as I stop talking. Something like a 34% increase in their organizational health, and so we have the facts, we have the data to support this model as being an effective one. So we're trying to encourage other funders to do the same.
Sorry, just to come off one more time, I actually would say that that is the number one thing that I would like to see personally from philanthropists and other funders is that they are paying attention to that piece of it and to the business development of every entity. Because yeah. And again, this is one of the wonderful things about no longer having every single dollar scrutinized by Congress.
And if I could just jump in from a philanthropic perspective, because we don't have the model that Lisa has. I think that's a gold standard. I think that's amazing. And I'm so glad Bloodwater is setting that example for the field. I think our indirect rate is like 17%. But I imagine that there are some grant seekers on this call. And I highly encourage folks to have a conversation with their program officer about that indirect rate and what other items you might be able to put into even your project budget that would still meet the standards of your funder. A lot of these policies are set definitely not at the officer level, maybe even at the board of directors level. But I have that conversation frequently with grantees, and we can often find ways to work in some of those costs in a project budget that meets the Hilton Foundation standards and is also helpful to the partner. So just remember that's always a negotiating process, really.
Thank you very much for that. We have a couple more questions. I would be interested to hear the panelists' thoughts on what structures, actions, and processes can be taken beyond funding and funding practices that can shift the sector towards impact-led, trust-based, and locally rooted.
So I can answer that in part because I actually think so. I think for me personally, the number one thing that should be asked every time anything is getting going, whether it be a project or a business or a NGO, is what problem are you solving? Because a lot of times, again, and this goes towards like sort of running to where the money is versus actually solving a problem. So I'll give an example of how I failed miserably. I started an entity in the Gambia about a decade ago. And I had started with this like idea of what we were going to bring better access to law in the Gambia. And what happened when I got started was I started chasing the funds and I started seeing, requests for proposals, and I would go and I would reshape how we were doing things to meet that proposal. And I lost track of what problem I was trying to solve. And so we solved a lot of things sort of temporarily, but ultimately I failed. And I failed because I lost vision and I lost my focus. And I think one of the things to do as we're starting to think about new structures is really as an organization doing some internal thinking of what do you want, what problem are you trying to solve, and then finding and working collaboratively with funders to try to come up with practical ways to solve that. And then, if you solve it, great. We move on to the next problem, and you keep building there. And I think like I used a lot of co-creation in USAID. I used it because we went in with an idea of what we wanted to do, but we had no idea how to get there. And I think listening to each other goes back to my point on listening. I think if we can build in structures where we're listening and both sides, the funder and the recipient, are at equal ground with each other from the beginning, I think you're going to see a more holistic structure that supports whatever the objective is. I hope that helps answer a little. I don't know if Lisa or Rachel have other thoughts.
No, I think that's amazing, Megan. And I think the theme of listening in this conversation is absolutely, if people walk away with one thing, that would be a great thing to walk away with. The other piece of this that we've been working on, okay, sorry. Yeah, just go grab one. Is there's actual infrastructure that's needed to be improved in order to invest more directly in local organizations, right? It's not always easy to move resources into these local entities. And Megan, I know this is like your body of work, but the philanthropic sector is also thinking about this and trying to build out what that would take. I know Humentum has had several efforts around standardizing due diligence practices so that we're not putting especially small organizations through the same questionnaire every 6 months for each funder. I recognize how much time that takes. There's new approaches to equivalency determinations and fiscal sponsorships and intermediary models. So that's another body of work that I don't think gets as much attention because it's not like super exciting to talk about, but I don't think the shifts we're talking about will be possible until that infrastructure is developed and improved. So that's another place.
I could not agree more with that.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions coming in, and we love to see our audience engaging with us. I would love to learn more from all of the speakers across your portfolios. What lessons have you learned about funding interventions in complex areas such as mental health, where impact often takes time to emerge and can be difficult to measure?
Yeah, Godfrey, thanks for that. It's such a timely question. I think mental health or other interventions that take a long time and are a long game, right? We're not buying food to give to someone tomorrow. This is a much longer journey to go on. I think there's work to be done on behalf of the organization and the leader to educate potential partners and funders around that long game. And I think it's easier when we can do the work beforehand to ensure that we're talking to the right funders. There are some funders out there who understand and actually prefer that type of long work, and there's others who don't get it. And so I think if I'm a leader in the mental health space, I'm going to be doing a lot of work to try to find funders who are aligned in order to increase your own return on energy you're spending on finding funders. And on top of that, I would recommend if it's okay for me to go so far as to make a recommendation, I would put in the time and effort to do the work to educate and don't assume that funders realize how important the long game is in some of these areas. And if I can make one last little plug without overstepping, before coming to Bloodwater, I did work in the fundraising space for a long while. And AI has its pros and its cons, but one thing I love about AI is that it really has democratized access to a lot of funding resources out there. And so if someone in this room is looking for funds and not using AI to help do that, I would really recommend that you start to do that because Godfrey, when I talk about finding funders who understand the work that goes into mental health support, I would definitely, that would be the first place I would go. And it wouldn't just be asking a question like, who funds mental health work? It would be, my model looks like this and this and this and this, and I need a funder who understands this and this and this and this. It would be a great big input to get some good data back.
Thank you. That was a great answer. Thank you very much for that, Lisa. We have our final question that reads, do you speakers have examples of innovative finance applied to human rights initiatives?
I'm sorry that I do not. Megan, it seems like if anyone here would, it would be you. Do you have?
I'm thinking, I will say I have, so I don't know if I want to call it human rights per se, but there have been sort of unique funding in the legal space just because access to justice and rule of law and other aspects within the governance space are so sort of intertwined with so many different areas that I have actually seen a lot of private investors sort of tie their money into let's say activities. Like I'll give you an example. In Paraguay, I worked on an activity where a private law firm had funded on its own, and then sort of USAID matched that funding. And they used their own innovative financing, and I'm not going to remember the details, and so I'm not going to go into details on what they used, but I will say that their funds for that project were raised through a variety, a sort of diversified portfolio of investments. And then what they did is they utilized that to create a legal system that allowed courts in Paraguay to better process constitutional law cases to make sure that the challenges to the Constitution, challenges to rights under that were going to be well heard and thought of efficiently and effectively. And they've now sort of spun that off into a private law run thing that helps because it benefits the businesses, it benefits the lawyers because it gets their cases sped up, but it also has a human rights impact. This is sort of a different than just human rights per se, but I would be interested in the person that asked that question. I would love for you to reach out to me because I think I have colleagues that have a better answer to that question who worked in the sort of democracy human rights space and have seen probably more examples than I have.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you all for joining. Thank you to Sheila for the great moderation. And thank you to you all, the panelists, for taking your time and joining us and really sharing this really valuable insights. And to our audience also for spending this hour with us. So I just wanted to quickly tell you about some of the work that we do at Humentum to you all that are new to us. Humentum strengthens non-for-profits, NGOs, and their funders by providing practical solutions to improve the effectiveness of the funding and finance, compliance, governance, and risk, organizational strategy and structure. We know that organizations are being asked to adapt faster under greater uncertainty than the existing models were designed to handle. And we can particularly hear that as well from the conversation that we've seen the panelists have had today. And that is why we equipped you to sustain, scale, or pivot today's complex environment so that you can build resilience for the future in a sustainable way. So we support organizations through individual, group, or organizational-wide trainings. We also do consultancy services led by sector experts. And then we also have a very robust membership platform with peer-to-peer networking on demand, courses, and leadership coaching sessions. So you can feel free to visit our website for more information, humentum.org. I will put it in the chat. And then also just to say, as mentioned in the beginning, this webinar series is part, or this webinar is part of a webinar series that we have. And we have our next webinar on the 28th of March. April, and it's titled Where Values Are Most Tested in Crisis, How Everyday Choices Strengthen or Weaken Alignment. And I think it very much speaks into what we've discussed today. How do we react and how do we live up to our values when we see crisis happening in our social good sector? So I thank you all for joining and wish you a good rest of your day. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Aisha.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.